In a packed courtroom, Judge Harrison Cole burst into laughter, mocking Keanu Reeves in front of reporters and rivals. "You may understand movies, Mr. Reeves, but you don't understand the law." Humiliated, yet unshaken, Keanu stood his ground. What he revealed moments later would silence the entire courtroom and change the trial forever. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The federal courthouse loomed like a fortress of judgment, its marble pillars glistening in the morning light. Cameras flashed outside, reporters shouted questions, and a restless crowd jostled for space on the steps. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Every seat in Courtroom 9 Amperes was filled, the benches lined with journalists, law students, and rival executives who had come to witness what many believed would be Keanu Reeves's downfall. Keanu sat quietly at the defendant's table, dressed in a plain, dark suit. Unlike the gleaming, perfectly tailored attorneys around him, his jacket hung slightly loose, his tie was modest, and his hair fell with its usual unstudied ease. He did not look like a man preparing for war in a courtroom. He looked like himself, unpolished, sincere, almost out of place among the polished wood, marble, and steel. Yet there was a stillness in his demeanor, a gravity that drew glances even from those who had come only to mock him. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's team radiated confidence. Their lead counsel, Leonard Graves, was a man known for his ruthless cross-examinations and his ability to turn truth into something twisted yet convincing. He represented a massive corporate rival, accusing Keanu's modest film foundation of intellectual property theft. At stake were not just millions in damages, but the survival of the foundation itself, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting underfunded filmmakers and preserving independent cinema. For days, the trial had dragged on, filled with charts, citations, and endless exchanges of technical jargon. Keanu had watched silently as his legal team tried to parry the attacks. They were skilled, polished, but their arguments felt lifeless. They spoke of statutes and precedents, but never of why the foundation existed, never of what it meant to the struggling artists who relied on it. Keanu could see the jury's eyes glazing over, their connection to the case evaporating. This morning, the battle reached its breaking point. Graves prowled before the jury box, his voice rich with practiced indignation. He twisted the testimony of one of Keanu's foundation staffers, painting the acquisition of a new digital archiving process as nothing more than stolen code from the rival corporation. "They didn't innovate," Graves declared, slamming his hand on the lectern for effect. "They stole. They took the hard work of others and wrapped it in sentimental language about art and preservation." Keanu's lead attorney rose for cross-examination, but his questions fell flat. Each objection was brushed aside. Judge Harrison Cole, stern and unmoving on the bench, overruled him with a curt shake of the head. The courtroom murmured as the opposing counsel returned to his seat, satisfied. It was a clear rout. Keanu clenched his jaw. His hand tightened around the pen he held, the ink pressing hard into the paper of his legal pad. On the page, he had scribbled a single note, underlined twice, "Tell them why it matters." He slid the note toward his lawyer, who glanced at it, shook his head, and whispered, "Not relevant. The judge won't allow it." The words hit Keanu harder than the accusations themselves. Not relevant. The stories of the filmmakers who poured their lives into the foundation, the vision of preserving art beyond profit, dismissed as irrelevant in a sea of technicalities. He had lived his career, hearing doubts, hearing dismissals, but never had it felt this suffocating. He could not sit silent any longer. As his attorney took his seat, Keanu rose. At once, the courtroom hushed. Reporters' pens hovered over notepads, cameras zoomed in, the gallery collectively leaning forward. Even his own team looked at him in alarm. No one had expected him to stand. No one had expected him to speak. Judge Cole's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Reeves," he said coldly, "are you stretching your legs, or do you intend to disrupt the court?" Keanu's voice was steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "Your Honor, with respect, I'd like to ask the witness a few questions myself." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some stifled laughs. Even the jury shifted uneasily. Lawyers exchanged incredulous looks. It was unheard of. He was not a lawyer, not trained, not a member of the bar. Judge Cole leaned back, removing his glasses. He polished them slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment. Then his lips curled into a thin smile. It began as a soft chuckle, then grew into a full laugh, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. It was not amusement. It was derision. It was mockery. "You, Mr. Reeves?" the judge finally said, wiping his eyes. "This is a courtroom, not a movie set. You may understand playing characters, but you clearly do not understand the law. Sit down and let the professionals do their work." The words hung heavy in the air. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing the exact moment. The actor beloved for his humility and resilience had been publicly belittled in front of a nation. Keanu's face remained calm, but inside, the sting was sharp. By the time the gavel struck, the damage was already done. Outside, headlines formed in real time. "Judge laughs, Keanu out of court." Social media boiled over, memes and clips spreading within minutes. To the world, it looked like Keanu Reeves had been broken, but in the silence of his seat, he knew differently. The courtroom emptied for recess, but the echoes of Judge Cole's laughter lingered like a stain on the walls. Reporters rushed out to file their stories, their voices carrying down the marble hallways. Keanu remained seated, motionless, staring at the grain of the polished wood table in front of him. His lawyers whispered frantically, their tones urgent, but he barely heard them. The single sound that replayed in his mind was the judge's derisive laugh. His advisor leaned close, voice hushed but sharp. "Keanu, you can't do that again. You're not licensed, you're not trained. If you speak out like that, he'll hold you in contempt. You'll not only lose the case, you'll destroy the foundation." Keanu's gaze lifted slowly. The foundation was all he could think of. Not the money, not his reputation. The filmmakers who had entrusted him with their dreams, the preservation of work that would vanish without support, those were the real stakes. And yet, in the courtroom, none of that had been heard. It had all been reduced to lines of code, technical disputes, and cold statutes. From the press gallery, the clicking of cameras never ceased. He knew what would come next. By nightfall, the clip would be everywhere, an aging actor ridiculed by a federal judge, laughed out of court. For the world, it would be entertainment. For him, it was a battle for something much deeper. When recess ended, Keanu stood again, not to speak, but to steady himself. The trial pressed on, the arguments resumed, but nothing felt the same. A line had been crossed. The judge had mocked him in front of the nation, and the world would not let him forget it. But neither would he. By late afternoon, the case was no longer confined to the courtroom. Screens across the nation replayed the clip on a loop. Judge Cole leaning back in his chair, the condescending smirk, the sudden burst of laughter that shook the walls of justice. News anchors described it as a rare moment of levity. Commentators on social media were less forgiving. Some mocked Keanu's audacity, while others expressed outrage at the judge's cruelty. Within hours, the phrase, "Keanu laughed out of court," trended worldwide. In the jury box, the shift was subtle, but unmistakable. A few jurors glanced at Keanu differently, not with neutrality, but with a trace of pity or worse, dismissal. That was the danger of humiliation in public. It seeped into perception, into credibility, into the silent judgment that could not be measured in statutes or objections. Keanu kept his composure. He had been underestimated before. He had been told he lacked the talent, that he was wooden, that he would never last in Hollywood. He had endured critics, loss, and grief. But this moment felt heavier. This wasn't about a film review. This was about integrity, about the right to stand in defense of something greater than himself. As court adjourned, reporters swarmed the hallway. Questions fired at him like bullets. "Mr. Reeves, how does it feel to be laughed at by a judge? Do you regret speaking up? Are you dropping the case?" Keanu kept walking, his silence frustrating the mob. Cameras flashed, microphones pressed close, but he gave them nothing. He stepped into the cool evening air, the marble steps beneath his feet, and in that breath of freedom outside the courthouse, one thought crystallized. The judge was wrong. By the next morning, the clip had reached every corner of the internet. Cable networks ran it on repeat, each replay accompanied by talking heads dissecting the humiliation in slow motion. Judge Harrison Cole's laugh had become a symbol of authority, putting a celebrity in his place. Headlines blared across screens. Hollywood actor humiliated in court. Judge laughs Reeves out of trial. Keanu's arrogance meets reality. What struck most observers was not just the laughter, but Keanu's silence afterward. He had not snapped back, had not stormed out. He had simply endured it, his expression calm, almost stoic, even as the ridicule filled the room. For the media, that silence became a canvas on which to paint their own stories. To some, he looked defeated. To others, he looked dignified. To his detractors, it was proof that he was out of his depth. The financial impact came swiftly. The foundation Keanu had spent years building, dedicated to supporting young filmmakers and preserving independent art, began to tremble under the weight of doubt. Donors, unnerved by the bad press, quietly reconsidered their commitments. A promised grant from a major arts organization froze in review. Within days, projects scheduled for filming were placed on indefinite hold. Staff whispered in hallways, uncertain whether their work would survive the storm. Inside his modest office, the atmosphere was tense. Phones rang with reporters demanding statements. Emails flooded in, half filled with mockery, half with sympathy. His close friend and advisor, Michael Donovan, paced back and forth, his frustration mounting. Michael had been with Keanu through many challenges, but this, he insisted, was different. "You have to say something," Michael urged, planting his hands on the desk where Keanu sat, staring out the window. A public apology, a statement of respect for the court, anything. "If you stay silent, they'll define this moment for you. Right now, the world sees you as a fool. You can't let that stand." Keanu turned slowly, his face thoughtful rather than angry. Would an apology make it true? Would it undo the laughter? Michael sighed heavily. It's not about truth, it's about perception. Judges, donors, the public, they don't care about what you meant. They care about what they saw, and what they saw was you trying to play lawyer and getting laughed out of the room. If you don't correct that, the foundation collapses. But Keanu said nothing. He leaned back, folding, his hands together, eyes distant. The memory of the judge's smirk replayed in his mind, sharper than any headline. It wasn't the loss of credibility that gnawed at him. It was the sting of being told he didn't understand the law, as though justice were a closed circle he had no right to enter. The silence stretched until Michael finally threw up his hands. "You're gonna let this ruin everything you built. Unless you start listening, we'll lose everything. Do you understand that?" Keanu nodded once, but his thoughts were already drifting not toward damage control, but toward something buried deeper. That evening, the foundation's small conference room was crowded with worried faces. Staff members sat around the table, their eyes darting nervously between laptops streaming the news and the man sitting quietly at the head. Keanu listened as Michael laid out the grim numbers. Donations suspended, sponsors pulling back, calls from partners who no longer wanted to be associated with a scandal. "Every hour we stay silent, the headlines tighten around us," Michael said, tapping the table with his pen. "You don't see it, but I do. These reporters aren't just covering a trial anymore. They're covering the supposed fall of Keanu Reeves. They want the story of the actor who thought he could outsmart the system and got burned. They're going to bury you if we don't respond." Across the room, one of the junior staffers, a young woman who had joined the foundation only months before, spoke hesitantly. "People are laughing, but some of them, they're angry at the judge. They think he was cruel. Maybe we can build on that, show that you were standing up for something bigger?" Michael shook his head. "Sympathy doesn't win trials. Respect does. Judges don't like being challenged, especially not by someone without credentials. We need to remind people that you're humble, that you defer to the court, that this was a moment of misplaced passion. Otherwise, this foundation, Everything we've worked for will be remembered only for this disaster." Keanu's gaze lingered on the staffer who had spoken, her voice trembling yet filled with belief. She hadn't spoken of money or headlines. She had spoken of the cruelty she had seen in that laughter. That was the truth he felt in his bones. But the truth had no place in the strategy being forced upon him. The meeting dragged on, each proposal more pragmatic than the last: hire a crisis manager, film a short apology video, issue a statement of contrition drafted by legal counsel. Each suggestion met the same quiet resistance. Keanu listened, nodded politely, then let the silence fall. His refusal wasn't loud, but it was immovable, like stone beneath water. Finally, the room emptied, leaving only Michael and Keanu. The friend dropped into a chair opposite him, rubbing his forehead. "You're killing me here, man. I've stood by you through everything. I've seen you bounce back when no one believed you would. But this is different. This is the law. The judge owns the battlefield. If you want to fight him, you'll lose. We need to survive this, not win it." Keanu leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. His voice was calm, steady, but carried an edge Michael hadn't heard before. "Surviving isn't enough. If I let this moment define me, if I let that laugh stand, then what's left of the truth we're protecting?" Michael exhaled, defeated. "Then tell me, what truth are you really protecting, Keanu? Because right now, I don't see it." For the first time all day, Keanu's eyes hardened, as if reaching back into a memory that had never left him. That night, Keanu walked the dim corridors of his home, the silence broken only by the hum of the city outside. His phone vibrated endlessly, with alerts, articles, tweets, late-night talk shows mocking the clip. Comedians imitated Judge Cole's laugh, looping it with his name attached. For the world, it was entertainment. For him, it was something else entirely. He stood at the window, staring at the blurred headlights below. His thoughts drifted away from the noise, from the mockery, to a memory he had kept locked away. Years ago, long before the world placed him on magazine covers, he had sat in a cramped office, facing consequences he didn't fully understand. He had been younger, uncertain, a boy caught in a moment of trouble that could have cost him everything. Back then, it wasn't fame that saved him. It wasn't money. It was a man who had looked at him not as a case file, but as a human being. Arthur Bellamy had been his lawyer, but more than that, a voice who explained that the law wasn't just statutes in books. It was supposed to be about fairness, about intent, about justice as something living and human. That lesson had settled deep within him, long before Hollywood lights ever found him. Now, as he replayed Judge Cole's words, he felt the contrast like a blade. You don't understand the law. But hadn't Arthur taught him that very understanding? That justice meant more than winning or losing, more than procedures designed to crush voices that didn't fit. The insult had pierced something far deeper than pride. It had touched the boy in that office who had once been told his story mattered. Downstairs, Michael was still awake, scrolling through reactions on his tablet. When Keanu entered, Michael looked up, exhaustion carved into his features. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" About what he said. Keanu sat opposite him, leaning forward, hands clasped. "When I was younger, I had a lawyer who didn't treat the law as a machine. He believed in its spirit. He showed me it wasn't about the rules, but about the truth inside them. That's why Judge Cole's words cut so deep. He wasn't just laughing at me, he was laughing at that truth." Michael set the tablet down, his voice softer now. "Then what are you going to do about it? Because I can tell you this, staying silent won't bring it back, and trying to fight him in court could destroy you." Keanu's eyes lifted, steady and resolved. "I'm not fighting him for me. I'm fighting for the idea that the law isn't just a cage for people who don't belong. If I let that go, then what's left of everything I've built?" Michael studied him for a long moment, then leaned back with a weary sigh. He knew that look. It was the same look Keanu had carried on film sets when directors told him a scene couldn't be done, the same look when critics declared his career over. Quiet, unshakable resolve. The fallout was real, The damage, undeniable. But beneath the noise and the losses, something else was stirring. Keanu Reeves, once mocked in front of a nation, was beginning to see the path forward, and it would not be the one anyone expected. The night after the headlines peaked, Keanu found himself unable to sleep. He sat at his desk, the glow of the city filtering faintly through the curtains, a pen idle in his hand. The sting of Judge Cole's words still pulsed like an open wound. He thought of Michael's warnings, of donors withdrawing, of the staff's worried faces. Yet beneath it all was something deeper, an echo from his past that refused to stay silent. Toronto, years ago. He could almost feel the chill of that winter again, sharp air filling his lungs as he walked the halls of his high school. Back then, he was just another awkward teenager, quiet, more at home with books and hockey than with confrontation. But confrontation had a way of finding him. It had started with a boy smaller than the rest, cornered in the hallway by 3 others who towered over him. They mocked him, shoved his books to the ground, and sneered at his accent. Keanu had stood at a distance, fists clenched, knowing the rules. Don't get involved. Don't make it worse. But when one of the bullies pushed the boy's head against a locker, something in him snapped. He stepped forward, voice steady but firm, telling them to stop. They didn't listen. One shove became 2, and before he could think, Keanu struck back. The fight was brief but chaotic. Teachers pulled them apart, students whispering in shock as they were dragged to the office. By the end of the day, Keanu faced suspension and possible expulsion. The school painted him as the aggressor. The parents of the bullies threatened legal action. His mother sat beside him in the principal's office, her hands trembling, her voice cracking as she tried to explain that they couldn't afford a lawyer. That was the first time he met Arthur Bellamy. The man was older, his suit worn, his tie slightly crooked, but his eyes were sharp, alive in a way that demanded attention. He had been assigned as Keanu's public defender, but from the first handshake, Keanu sensed he was different. He didn't start with the charges or the paperwork or the risk of expulsion. He started with a question that cut through the fear. Why did you do it? Keanu had stammered, fumbling for words. They were hurting him. I couldn't just stand there. Arthur had leaned back, studying him, then nodded. So, you acted not because you wanted to fight, but because someone needed you to. That small acknowledgement, simple, human, shifted everything. For the first time since the incident, Keanu felt seen. Arthur didn't treat him like a troublemaker or a case file. He treated him like a boy who had made a choice worth defending. The hearings that followed were tense. The school board was determined to make an example of him. Arthur, however, wove a narrative that no one expected. He didn't deny the fight. He didn't bury the facts. Instead, he argued that the rules of discipline must serve justice, not destroy it. He painted Keanu not as a delinquent, but as a protector, a student who had chosen to shield another at personal risk. It was not a technical argument. It was a story, and it worked. The school board had expected Arthur Bellamy to be like every other overworked public defender, someone who shuffled papers, begged for leniency, and moved on. Instead, he dismantled their narrative, piece by piece. He reminded them that the boy Keanu had defended had been harassed for months and that the staff had failed to intervene. He forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Rules were meaningless if they punished those who showed courage in the face of cruelty. When the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, Arthur pressed harder. "We cannot teach young people that silence is safer than decency," he told them, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. Discipline without justice creates fear, not order. This young man acted where adults failed to act. If you punish him for that, what lesson are you really teaching? The words struck Keanu like thunder. Sitting there, a nervous teenager with his future in jeopardy, he realized he was not listening to legal jargon. He was listening to someone who believed that law could breathe, that it could protect rather than destroy. He had never thought of justice in that way before. The board reluctantly backed down. Expulsion was off the table. His suspension was reduced, and the incident reframed as a disciplinary matter rather than a criminal one. The bullies received warnings and were transferred to different classes. Keanu was free to return to school without a permanent stain on his record. When the hearing ended, Keanu lingered in Arthur's cramped office. Books lined the walls in uneven stacks, cases and law journals spilling onto the desk. It wasn't glamorous. There were no plaques or gleaming diplomas on display. Yet in that space, Keanu felt something stronger than prestige. He felt truth. Arthur offered him a seat and poured 2 cups of tea from a battered kettle. "You know," he said, handing one to Keanu, "you'll face more of this in your life. Not just fights in hallways, but systems that want to tell you who you are. Sometimes they'll be right. Sometimes they'll be very wrong. The law is supposed to stand for justice, but too often it's used as a weapon by those who already have power. Remember this. Justice isn't the letter of the rule. It's the spirit behind it." Keanu sipped the tea, the words sinking deep. He asked him what that meant, how to tell the difference. Arthur smiled faintly. "You'll know. When you see something that feels wrong, even if the rules say it's right, that's when you listen to the spirit. That's when you stand up, even if they laugh at you for it." The lesson was simple, but it carved itself into his memory. For years afterward, through auditions, failures, and the grind of Hollywood, he carried that belief like an ember in his chest. He didn't often speak of it, but it guided him quietly. And now, decades later, as he sat in his office, replaying Judge Cole's laughter, that ember flared again. The man who had once saved him with those words had disappeared from the legal world long ago. No one knew where Arthur Bellamy had gone or why he had walked away from law. But Keanu knew this much. If anyone could help him now, it was Arthur. Keanu rose from his chair and began to pace. The memory of Arthur Bellamy so vivid it felt as though the man had been in the room only yesterday. He could still picture the defender's weary face, the frayed cuffs of his shirt, and the intensity in his eyes when he spoke about justice as if it were something alive. That day in Toronto had been more than the resolution of a school fight. It had been the day Keanu first realized the law was not just a cold machine, but a mirror of human conscience. But Arthur had vanished. Not long after Keanu graduated, whispers circulated that the man had abandoned the practice of law. Some said he had grown disillusioned, others that he had clashed with powerful figures who wanted him silenced. By the time Keanu returned to visit his old neighborhood, Arthur's office was shuttered, its windows covered in dust. The man who had once stood like a giant in his memory had simply disappeared. For years, Keanu carried Arthur's words in silence, almost like a secret. He never spoke of him in interviews, never wove him into stories of his career. But whenever he faced cruelty, whenever he was tempted to retreat in the face of scorn, he remembered the question Arthur had asked. Why did you do it? It was a question that demanded more than excuses. It demanded a reason worth standing for. Now, Judge Cole's laughter had ripped open that memory. To the world, it was just a humiliating moment, another clip for the late-night shows. But to Keanu, it was the same test he had faced as a boy in Toronto, whether to stand up when others demanded silence. And this time, the stakes were greater than detention or expulsion. This time, an entire foundation, years of work, and the voices of filmmakers who could not defend themselves were at risk. Michael had urged him to apologize, to bow his head, to preserve what little reputation the foundation still had left. But Keanu knew that wouldn't work. He wasn't facing a simple scandal. He was facing the embodiment of everything Arthur had warned him about. A system that prized procedure over justice, power over fairness, the letter over the spirit. He sat back at his desk, the city lights blurring in his tired eyes, and whispered the name aloud for the first time in decades. Arthur Bellamy. The sound of it felt heavy, almost forbidden, but also grounding. Somewhere out there, the man who had once defended him still lived, even if hidden. If anyone could help him face Judge Cole, it was the same man who had taught him to believe in justice when he was 16. Keanu leaned forward, determination hardening in his chest. The path ahead was uncertain, and the world already thought him beaten. But he knew one thing, with absolute clarity. To fight this battle, he needed to find Arthur Bellamy, and he would not stop until he did. The emergency meeting was called for the next morning, held in a rented conference room high above the city. The skyline stretched out in cold blue light, but inside the atmosphere was tense, claustrophobic. Every chair around the long mahogany table was filled. The Foundation's legal team, public relations experts, and financial advisors sat hunched over folders and laptops, their faces grim. Keanu entered quietly, his posture calm but unreadable. He looked out of place amid the expensive suits and polished shoes, but his presence silenced the room. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the lead attorney, a silver-haired man with decades of courtroom experience, cleared his throat. "Mr. Reeves," he began, choosing his words carefully, "we've reviewed the situation. Yesterday's incident has left us in a precarious position. The judge's reaction, coupled with the media frenzy, has damaged your credibility with the court. If we proceed aggressively, we risk total collapse. The wisest course of action is to settle, quietly, quickly, with as little damage to your reputation and finances as possible." Murmurs of agreement circled the table. One of the PR specialists added, "And we strongly recommend a public apology. Not to admit guilt, of course, but to show respect for the court. It will soften the narrative, make you appear humble. Without it, the headlines will continue to crucify you." Keanu listened, his hands folded on the table. His eyes moved slowly from face to face, reading the fear behind their arguments. They weren't strategizing for victory, they were strategizing for surrender. Michael Donovan leaned forward, his tone urgent. "Keanu, they're right. We can't win against Judge Cole. He's already made up his mind about you. Every move you make now, he'll crush. If you keep pushing, the Foundation goes under. You'll lose everything." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Lose everything," he repeated softly, as though testing the words. Then he leaned back in his chair, the faintest trace of a smile forming. "You all speak as if survival is enough." The lead attorney frowned. "With respect, survival is everything. You've already taken a beating in the court of public opinion. If you give the judge another reason, he'll bury you. We can manage the fallout if we act now, but if you insist on continuing as you are, it will be suicide." The word hung in the air, sharp and final. Suicide. It was meant to frighten him, to corner him into compliance. But to Keanu, it was fuel. His entire life had been built on the back of people telling him he couldn't succeed, couldn't last, couldn't win. He had heard it before, in darker rooms and lonelier moments. And yet, here he was. He stood suddenly, pushing his chair back. The sound echoed against the walls, startling the room into silence. His voice was calm, but resolute. "Then let me make this clear. We are not settling, we are not apologizing, and we are not retreating." Gasps broke out. Michael's head dropped into his hands. The attorneys looked at one another in disbelief. But Keanu's eyes were steady, his voice unwavering. "I will give the closing argument myself." The room erupted the moment the words left his mouth. Half a dozen lawyers spoke at once, voices rising in disbelief. One of them slammed a folder shut with enough force to rattle glasses of water on the table. Another leaned forward, his face flushed red, and hissed, "This is madness. You cannot possibly believe you can stand before a federal judge and argue the law without credentials. He will hold you in contempt before you finish a sentence." Michael tried to calm the storm, but his own voice was trembling. "Keanu, think about what you're saying. This isn't a movie script you can improvise. This is federal law. You've got corporations, seasoned litigators, and a judge who already despises you. Do you have any idea what he'll do if you try this?" Keanu didn't flinch. He let the noise crash around him, then slowly raised a hand. The room fell quiet, though the tension remained thick. His tone was measured, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of finality. "I've heard all your strategies. Every one of them amounts to the same thing. Retreat. You want me to bow, to apologize for caring, to accept humiliation in order to protect numbers on a balance sheet. But this isn't about balance sheets. This is about truth." One of the senior litigators scoffed. "Truth? Truth doesn't win cases, Mr. Reeves. The law is not about feelings. It is about statutes, precedent, and procedure. You step out of line, and Judge Cole will cut you down. He will destroy you and everything tied to you. You want to risk your foundation for some philosophical stand? Keanu's gaze didn't waver. It isn't philosophy. It's the only way forward. If we give in now, we confirm exactly what he wants the world to believe, that I don't belong in that courtroom, that I don't understand what matters, but I do. I lived it once, long before I ever stepped onto a film set. Michael ran a hand down his face, exhausted. So, what you think you can walk into that courtroom and out-argue Cole? That's not bravery, Keanu. That's suicide. He'll relish the chance to humiliate you again. He'll make you the punchline of every headline for the rest of your life. Keanu stepped closer, his presence quieting the room once more. Then let him try. Because I won't let fear of laughter decide the outcome. I'd rather fall fighting for what matters than survive by apologizing for something I didn't do. The lawyers exchanged helpless glances. Some began gathering their papers, already resigning themselves to departure. One finally stood, shaking his head. We can't be a part of this. If you insist on representing yourself in any capacity, we're finished here. Keanu nodded, unshaken. Then, you're released. Thank you for your time. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouting had been. The majority of his legal team filed out, their footsteps echoing down the hall. What remained was Michael, staring at him as if trying to decipher whether his friend had just signed his own death warrant. When the door finally closed behind the departing lawyers, the conference room felt cavernous, its long table suddenly too big for the two men who remained. Michael leaned back in his chair, staring at Keanu as if he were looking at a stranger. You just fired nearly every attorney we had, he said slowly, his voice flat with disbelief. Do you realize what you've done? You've left yourself with no protection. Keanu sank into the seat across from him. His expression wasn't reckless or impulsive. It was steady, deliberate. I haven't left myself unprotected, he said. I've chosen a different kind of defense. Michael shook his head. A defense that doesn't exist. Keanu, this isn't how the world works. You can't just step into a courtroom and... I'm not stepping in unprepared, Keanu interrupted. His voice was calm, but beneath it ran something harder, sharper. I've been here before, Michael. Not in this courtroom, not with these stakes, but I know what it feels like to be told you don't belong. I know what it means when someone tries to laugh you out of the room, and I know the one man who can show me how to fight back the right way. Michael frowned. One man? Who? Keanu hesitated for a moment, almost as if saying the name out loud would make the weight of the past too real. Finally, he said it. Arthur Bellamy. Michael blinked. Arthur Bellamy? Who is that? Keanu leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his voice low. He was a public defender when I was a teenager. I almost got expelled for defending another student. Everyone said I was finished. Arthur was the only one who saw the truth. He fought for me, not with loopholes or clever tricks, but with belief. He taught me that the law isn't just rules, it's supposed to mean something. Without him, I wouldn't have made it through that moment. Michael rubbed his temples. Keanu, even if this man exists, even if he was brilliant back then, where is he now? You said he vanished from the legal world years ago. You can't pin everything on someone who may not even want to be found. Keanu's jaw tightened. Then I'll give him a reason. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at the screen. For years, the number had stayed in his contacts, untouched, like a relic from another life. He didn't even know if it still worked. His thumb hovered for a long moment over the keys before he began typing a message. It was brief, nothing more than a few words. I need your help. It's Keanu. He stared at it, then hit send. The message shot off into the unknown, carrying with it decades of memory, gratitude, and hope. Michael exhaled heavily, watching him. If this man doesn't answer, what then? Keanu pocketed the phone. His expression didn't change. Then I'll keep fighting anyway, but if he does answer, then maybe we still have a chance. The reply came the next morning, Keanu had barely slept, replaying the moment in the courtroom, Judge Cole's laughter echoing in his head like a wound that refused to close. He reached for his phone almost absent-mindedly, expecting silence, expecting nothing. But there it was, a message, short and cryptic. No greeting, no name, just an address. It was a part of the city Keanu hadn't visited in decades. Forgotten streets with shuttered storefronts, old brick buildings covered in faded paint, corners that seemed stuck in another era. He read the address 3 times before his pulse began to quicken. It was real. It was a summons, as clear as if Arthur had spoken the words himself. By late afternoon, Keanu found himself driving through neighborhoods that looked worn by time. The modern glass towers of Los Angeles had long since vanished from the rearview mirror. Here, the sidewalks were cracked, telephone wires sagged overhead, and the occasional passerby moved with the tired pace of people accustomed to being overlooked. He parked in front of a building so narrow and plain it seemed invisible. Its windows were clouded with dust, and a hand-painted sign hung crooked above the door. Arthur Bellamy, attorney at law. The letters were so faded they looked almost ghostly. Keanu stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, staring at the door, his breath visible in the cool air. Finally, he pushed it open. The inside smelled of paper and dust, the kind of air that clung to rooms where time had stopped. Stacks of files lined the walls. Shelves sagged under the weight of leather-bound volumes, and the desk in the center was scarred with decades of use. Sitting behind it, hunched but alert, was a man Keanu recognized instantly, though age had carved its story into him. Arthur Bellamy. His hair was white now, cropped short but unruly. His face was weathered, deep lines etched around his mouth and eyes, but those eyes, sharp, dark, unblinking, were exactly as Keanu remembered. They cut through the air with the same intensity that had once unsettled school administrators and prosecutors alike. Arthur didn't stand. He barely moved. Instead, he adjusted his glasses and said, in a voice that carried gravel and fatigue, "You should not have come here." Keanu felt the words land like a weight, but he stepped further inside. "I didn't know where else to go." Arthur studied him, unsmiling. "The world knows your face. They laugh at you on every screen. Do you know what it means, walking into my office again, after all these years?" Keanu nodded slowly. "It means I still believe in what you taught me, that justice isn't just a rule book, that truth matters." Arthur leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. "The law doesn't care about truth, Keanu. Not anymore. It's a game, played by ambitious men, and you're standing in the middle of their board." Arthur's words hung in the air, heavy and bitter. He turned away, his gaze drifting toward a window so clouded with grime it barely let the daylight through. "Do you know who else once sat in that chair you're standing by?" he asked, his voice quiet but laced with something darker. Keanu didn't answer. He waited. Arthur's eyes flicked back to him, sharp as ever. "Harrison Cole, the judge who laughed at you. He wasn't always the cold shell you saw in that courtroom. Once, he was brilliant. He had a mind that could cut through any argument, a fire in him to stand up for the powerless. I thought he was going to change the law for the better." Keanu's jaw tightened at the name. Hearing it here, spoken in this forgotten office, made the humiliation of the courtroom feel sharper. "You trained him?" Arthur nodded slowly. "I did more than train him. I believed in him. I took him under my wing. He was my protege, the one I thought would carry forward everything I stood for. But ambition is a disease, Keanu. It eats away at conviction, at conscience. Harrison wanted victories. He wanted recognition. And the system rewarded him when he chose rules over justice, power over principle." The old lawyer's hand trembled as he reached for a yellowed case file on his desk, then stopped halfway and pulled it back, as if the past was too heavy to touch again. "The day we parted ways, I knew the law was finished for me. I couldn't keep pretending the game hadn't swallowed it whole, so I walked away." Keanu listened, every word searing into him. He could picture it, a younger Judge Cole, standing in this same room, absorbing Arthur's lessons before betraying them. It explained the venom in Cole's laughter, the contempt in his words. It wasn't just personal. It was the shadow of an old wound carried into the present. "I'm not Harrison Cole," Keanu said firmly. "I don't want ambition. I don't want to win for the sake of winning. I just want the truth to be heard." Arthur studied him, eyes narrowing, searching his face as though trying to see if the words were genuine. "And what makes you think truth has a place in that courtroom? You've seen how he rules. Cold, exact, detached. He doesn't hear the heart in an argument, only the letter of the law. You stand against him, and he will destroy you." Keanu stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then, teach me how not to be destroyed." "Teach me how to make him hear something he spent his life trying to bury." Arthur didn't reply. He stared down at his hands, scarred and trembling, as though torn between disbelief and a flicker of something long dormant. His silence was heavier than words. The silence stretched until the ticking of an old clock on the wall became deafening. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his eyes clouded not with weakness, but with the weight of years. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "Do you even understand what you're asking of me, Keanu? To step back into a world I swore I would never touch. Again. To face a man I once called my son." Keanu's chest tightened. "I'm asking you to help me show him what he's forgotten. You told me once the law was meant to serve people, not crush them. If you believed that then, why stop believing it now?" Arthur gave a bitter laugh, one that ended in a cough. He wiped his mouth with a shaking hand. "Because belief without victory feels like delusion. I fought for decades, and all it got me was an empty office and a reputation for being naive. Cole played the game, and the world rewarded him with a robe and a gavel. That laugh he threw at you, that's the law now, mocking anyone foolish enough to think justice still matters." Keanu stepped forward, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "Then let me be the fool. If I fail, I'll fail trying to fight for what you taught me. But I can't walk away. Not after that courtroom. Not after he turned my name into a punchline. I'm not here to salvage my pride. I'm here to prove truth still has power, even if it's only once, even if it costs me everything." Arthur's eyes softened for the first time. He saw not the actor the world knew, but the same boy who had once sat in this office, wide-eyed and desperate, clinging to a sense of right and wrong in a world eager to dismiss it. That boy was still alive in Keanu's voice. He stood slowly, his joints stiff with age, and walked to a shelf sagging under old casebooks. His hand lingered over the spines, trembling as though they carried both hope and ghosts. "Harrison Cole," he said quietly, "was the brightest legal mind I'd ever seen. But he buried his heart to sharpen that mind. If you want to face him, you can't beat him at his own game. He knows every rule, every precedent. The only way through him is to make him remember the man he once was." He pulled a worn leather volume from the shelf and set it on the desk with a heavy thud. Dust rose in the dim light. "If I agree to help..."
"You, Keanu. There's no halfway. You'll give yourself over completely. No cameras, no glamour, no distractions.
Just you, me, and the fight to wake a conscience that's been dead for 30 years. Do you understand what that means?" Keanu nodded without hesitation. "I understand." Arthur studied him for a long moment, then gave the faintest nod. "Then God help us both. Because this time, we're not just fighting a case, we're fighting a ghost." The next evening, Arthur led Keanu to a place that felt worlds away from the polished marble of the courthouse. It was an old rehearsal warehouse tucked behind a chain-link fence, the kind of building once used for stage crews and set design. Its brick walls were cracked, the high windows streaked with dust, and the air smelled faintly of sawdust and rusted metal. For most, it was forgotten space. But for Arthur, it was to become their classroom. Inside, the vast room stretched into shadow, lit only by a few bare bulbs strung from overhead beams. A long table sat in the center, piled high with casebooks, statutes, and binders so thick they looked like they could break bone if dropped. Folding chairs stood on either side, worn from years of use. Arthur gestured to it with a dry smile. "Welcome to law school," he muttered. Keanu glanced at the towering stacks. "Where do we start?" Arthur's sharp eyes fixed on him. "With the first rule: no technology. No laptops, no phones, no shortcuts. The answer isn't on a glowing screen. It's in these books, in the arguments of those who came before us. You want to fight Cole? Then you need to understand the language he lives in." Keanu nodded, setting his phone aside. His entire life had revolved around cameras, scripts, digital edits, the immediacy of performance. But now, stripped of tools and comfort, he felt like a student again, bare and uncertain. Arthur opened a volume with brittle pages, the name of a 19th century case embossed on the cover. "You think you're here to memorize statutes and precedents? Wrong. The law isn't code. It's not a formula where you input facts and output a result. The law is a story. It's the story of people, of conflict, of the choices that shape society. If you can't tell that story, you can't win." They began. Before dawn the next morning, Arthur woke Keanu with the sound of books slamming on the table, demanding his focus immediately. Hour after hour, Arthur fired questions like arrows. What is justice? What is precedent? What is fairness when rules and truth collide? Keanu struggled, tripping over technical language, fumbling through pages of unfamiliar citations. Each mistake drew sharp correction. Each hesitation met with Arthur's relentless prodding. "You're thinking like an actor," Arthur snapped during one grueling exchange. "You're searching for the right line, the perfect delivery. This isn't a performance. It's a battle for meaning. You don't play the role of truth. You embody it. Until it comes from your bones, you'll never withstand Cole." By midnight, Keanu's eyes burned, his fingers ink-stained from hours of note-taking. Yet when Arthur finally called for a pause, Keanu realized something remarkable. He wasn't broken. He was hungry. For the first time since the laughter in the courtroom, he felt the stirrings of strength. Arthur watched him quietly. "Good," he said, softer now. "You've survived the first day. Tomorrow, we start again, and we go deeper." The second week hit harder than the first. The warehouse became a crucible where every flaw in Keanu's reasoning was burned away. Arthur showed no mercy. He'd interrupt mid-sentence, tear apart an argument, force Keanu to rebuild it from scratch. "Stop reciting lines," he barked more than once. "This isn't about sounding clever. It's about making people feel why the law matters." Keanu's instincts as an actor collided with the rigid B. "Discipline," Arthur demanded. He was trained to express emotion, to let silence breathe, to capture an audience with tone and pause. But whenever he leaned too heavily on dramatic delivery, Arthur cut him down. "You're not playing Hamlet. You're fighting for the soul of the law. Theatrics without substance are dust." One night, after hours of being pressed, Keanu slammed a book shut. "Maybe I'm not built for this," he said, his voice hoarse. "You want me to think like a lawyer, but I've never been one. I don't know all these codes and citations. I can't match someone like Cole in his own arena." Arthur leaned forward, his gaze fierce. "And you never will. That's your strength." Keanu froze. Arthur continued, his tone cutting but purposeful. "Cole is a master of rules. He's memorized every statute, every precedent. He wields them like weapons, sharp and precise. If you try to beat him at that, you will fail. But law isn't just rules, it's meaning. It's the story of why those rules exist. You are a storyteller, Keanu. Use that. Show the jury, the press, even Cole himself what those statutes were meant to protect, not just how they're written. That's something no textbook can teach him to resist." For the first time, Keanu saw the crack in the wall. He realized he didn't have to erase who he was, an actor, a man who understood emotion, presence, human connection. Instead, he had to channel it through discipline, ground it in principle. The law as story, as Arthur kept repeating, began to take root. They worked into the early hours, weaving cases into narratives. Arthur had him retell the story of a landmark ruling not in legal jargon, but as if he were explaining it to a neighbor over dinner. Why does this matter? Who does it protect? What would the world look like without it? Arthur pressed until Keanu's answers carried weight, not just form. It was exhausting. It was humbling. But it was also transformative. Slowly, Keanu stopped trying to imitate a lawyer. Instead, he began merging what he knew how to inhabit emotion, how to move an audience with the principles Arthur drilled into him. Each day, his voice grew steadier, his arguments sharper, his conviction deeper. Arthur caught the shift. One night, after a particularly intense session, he nodded, almost imperceptibly. "You're beginning to understand. The law isn't code, it's a story. And stories, when told with truth, can shake even a man like Harrison Cole." The breakthrough came late on a Sunday night, when exhaustion pressed on Keanu like a second skin. His hands were ink-stained, his voice ragged, and the floor around his chair was littered with scraps of notes he had torn up in frustration. Arthur sat across from him, arms folded, waiting for the latest attempt at a closing argument exercise. Keanu inhaled, forcing himself to focus. He began with technical points, statutes, procedural language, citation after citation. His words stumbled, dry, lifeless. Arthur closed his eyes and shook his head. "Stop, that's noise. Do you believe anything you just said?" Keanu snapped, slamming the book shut. "I don't know what you want from me. I've been at this for days. You tell me not to act, not to perform, not to recite, then what am I supposed to do?" Arthur leaned forward, his voice sharp but calm. "Tell me why it matters." Keanu blinked. "What?" Arthur's eyes narrowed. "Forget the codes. Forget the rules. Forget Cole. Tell me why this case matters to you, right now, from your gut." The room fell silent, except for the buzzing of the overhead bulb. Keanu lowered his head, closed his eyes, and thought about the humiliation in the courtroom, the sting of laughter echoing off marble walls. He thought about the people his foundation supported, the young filmmakers, the struggling storytellers who would lose everything if this case went the wrong way. He thought about truth, about the difference Arthur had made in his life decades earlier, when no one else had believed in him. And then the words came. Not polished, not rehearsed, but raw. This case isn't about contracts or technicalities. It's about whether stories can belong to the people who create them, or whether power gets to rewrite them. My foundation isn't stealing. It's preserving dreams, giving people a voice who otherwise wouldn't have one. If the law exists only to protect corporations, then it fails the very people it's meant to serve. This isn't about me winning. It's about proving that progress, that creativity, that truth still has a place in a world ruled by procedure. Arthur didn't move. He didn't interrupt. For the first time, he let Keanu speak without cutting him down. When Keanu finally stopped, the silence lingered. Arthur's gaze softened, and slowly, a faint, approving smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Now," he said quietly, "that was an argument. Not because it was clever. Not because it was perfect, but because it was yours." Keanu exhaled, realizing his heart was pounding as though he had just stepped off a stage. But this wasn't performance, it was truth. And in that moment, he finally understood what Arthur had been trying to carve into him all along. Arthur closed the book in front of him and pushed it aside. "You're ready to learn the real fight. Tomorrow, we begin shaping this into something that can stand in court. Harrison Cole won't see it coming." Arthur stacked 3 heavy books in front of Keanu the next morning. Their cracked leather bindings looked as though they had endured 100 years of dust and debate. He tapped the top volume with a finger that trembled from age, but still carried authority. "If you want to face Harrison Cole, you must study those who fought battles long before you. These cases are more than rulings, they are stories of humanity colliding with power." Keanu pulled the first book toward him. The language was dense, every sentence wound with legal terms that felt like walls. Yet Arthur guided him through, stripping away the technical phrases until the human core appeared. "This case," Arthur said, pointing to the yellowed text, was about a farmer who invented a new type of plow in the 1800s. Corporations tried to bury him, saying his design violated obscure land laws. They wanted to crush him before his idea could take root. Keanu read aloud, stumbling through the rigid language, until Arthur cut in. "Stop reciting. What does it mean? What's the story here?" Keanu frowned, flipping through the pages. He wasn't just fighting for a plow. He was fighting to feed people, to prove one man's work could matter against the weight of giants. Arthur's eyes sharpened. Yes, that's the argument that saved him. Not a technicality, not a clever loophole. The lawyer asked the court one question: should the law prevent a farmer from helping his children eat? That truth swayed the decision, not the citations. The words sank deep. Keanu leaned back, his mind flashing to his own case. His foundation, accused of theft, was being painted as reckless. Yet its purpose was the opposite. It existed to give struggling storytellers a chance to create. He realized his battle wasn't about intellectual property on paper. It was about whether voices could survive in a world that preferred silence. Arthur pushed the second book across the table. "Now, make the argument. Yourself. Pretend you're that lawyer. Convince me." Keanu stood slowly, clutching the book like a script, but instead of reading, he set it down. His voice carried into the dusty warehouse, uneven at first, but growing steady. This man's invention wasn't a violation. It was hope, a tool that made the impossible possible. And if the law exists only to stop progress, then it serves no one, Arthur interrupted. "Too stiff. You sound like you're still acting. Try again. Don't play the lawyer. Be the man who believes in this farmer's children. Speak to me like you're begging the court not to starve them." Keanu tried again. This time, he didn't think about delivery. He thought about the boy he once was in Toronto. The fear of losing everything. The need for someone to believe him. His voice broke slightly, but it was real. Arthur's gaze softened. "Better. Don't act. Believe." Arthur didn't allow Keanu to savor the small victory. He snapped his fingers sharply, pacing the warehouse floor like a conductor preparing for another movement. "Again," he demanded. "But this time, forget the farmer. Forget the plow. Speak about your own foundation. Why should anyone care about what you do? Why should anyone believe you're not just another actor with money to burn?" Keanu hesitated, feeling the sting in the words. He thought of the young directors and writers his foundation had supported, the small theaters it had kept alive when funding dried up, the scholarships given to kids who would never otherwise have touched a camera. His chest tightened. He drew a breath. "Because these aren't faceless projects. They're lives. A girl from Oklahoma wrote her first play because of us. A boy from Detroit held a camera for the first time and told his family's story. If the law says their voices can be stolen, then it says dreams don't matter. I can't accept that." Arthur raised a hand, cutting him off. "Good heart, but you lost me. Halfway through, you rambled. Trim it down. Every word should be a blade, not a feather." They repeated the exercise for hours. Keanu spoke. Arthur critiqued. Sometimes the criticism was brutal, too theatrical. "You sound like you're delivering lines from a stage." Other times it was precise. You paused at the wrong moment. That silence didn't build power, it drained it. Keanu adjusted. Tried again. Failed. Tried again. The rhythm of their work became like the rhythm of sparring fighters. One attacking, the other parrying, until muscle memory began to form. By the fourth round, Keanu's gestures grew more natural, no longer choreographed but instinctive. When he spoke about the boy from Detroit, his hand pressed unconsciously to his chest, as if the truth were pounding inside him. When he described corporations silencing small artists, his voice rose not with practiced drama, but with the roughness of anger, barely restrained. Arthur sat back finally, studying him with narrowed eyes. "That's closer. You're not an actor anymore. You're an advocate. The courtroom doesn't need a performance. It needs a man who believes every word he speaks." Keanu's throat burned. His body ached from tension. But there was something alive in him now. He realized this training wasn't about erasing his instincts as a performer, but transforming them. He wasn't pretending anymore. He was fighting. Arthur handed him another case file, thin, but weathered. One more for tonight. A factory worker injured on the job, left penniless because the company found a loophole. His lawyer didn't drown the court in citations. He told the story of a man who gave his hands to labor and was abandoned when those hands broke. That story won. Keanu flipped open the file, his eyes burning with fatigue, yet burning brighter with conviction. He knew this wasn't just practice anymore. Each case was a mirror reflecting his own fight, and every retelling pulled him closer to the truth he needed to deliver. The nights grew longer, the warehouse colder. Keanu lost track of time, his world reduced to books, Arthur's gravelly voice, and the echo of his own words bouncing off concrete walls. Every evening ended with his throat raw, his body weary, but his mind sharper than it had ever been. One night, Arthur tested him without warning. He tossed a casebook onto the table and barked, "Closing argument, 2 minutes, go." Keanu froze. "I don't even know the details of that case." Arthur pointed at him with sudden fire. "Then make me care without them. Speak from principle. Show me you've learned something." Keanu stood, heart hammering. He closed his eyes, let the noise of panic fade, and spoke. "This isn't about pages of law. It's about a man who dared to stand against giants. You don't need every detail to see what matters. Justice means protecting the powerless when rules are bent to break them. If the court ignores that, then it tells every ordinary man he has no chance." Arthur leaned back, silent, for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. "You're starting to get it." That nod was worth more than hours of praise. It meant Keanu had broken through. He was no longer mimicking arguments, he was inhabiting them. They moved into physical presence next. Arthur forced him to pace the room while speaking, to hold eye contact without faltering, to use silence like a weapon. "Don't fill every second with words," Arthur scolded. "Let them sit in it. A pause can strike harder than a speech if you believe what follows." Keanu practiced until the pauses became as natural as breath. When he stopped mid-sentence, the air itself seemed to lean forward, waiting. By the end of the third week, Arthur finally allowed himself a rare smile. "You're not reciting anymore. You're not acting. You're believing. That's the only thing that can pierce Cole's armor. He's heard every clever trick, every polished line, but he hasn't heard truth in decades. That's what you'll bring." Keanu felt it too. The laughter from the courtroom still echoed in his mind, but it no longer cut like a wound. Now, it burned like fuel. He wasn't walking into Cole's court to perform. He was walking in to remind the judge, the jury, and the world that the law had a heart and he intended to make them hear it beat. Arthur closed the final casebook and pushed it aside. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow, we begin crafting the real thing. The closing argument. Your voice. Your story. The one that will decide everything." For the first time, Keanu didn't feel fear at those words. He felt ready. The nights grew longer, the warehouse colder. Keanu lost track of time, his world reduced to books, Arthur's gravelly voice, and the echo of his own words bouncing off concrete walls. Every evening ended with his throat raw, his body weary, but his mind sharper than it had ever been. One night, Arthur tested him without warning. He tossed a casebook onto the table and barked, "Closing argument, 2 minutes. Go." Keanu froze. "I don't even know the details of that case." Arthur pointed at him with sudden fire. Then, "Make me care without them. Speak from principle. Show me you've learned something." Keanu stood, heart hammering. He closed his eyes, let the noise of panic fade, and spoke. "This isn't about pages of law. It's about a man who dared to stand against giants. You don't need every detail to see what matters. Justice means protecting the powerless when rules are bent to break them. If the court ignores that, then it tells every ordinary man he has no chance." Arthur leaned back, silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. "You're starting to get it." That nod was worth more than hours of praise. It meant Keanu had broken through. He was no longer mimicking arguments. he was inhabiting them. They moved into physical presence next. Arthur forced him to pace the room while speaking, to hold eye contact without faltering, to use silence like a weapon. "Don't fill every second with words," Arthur scolded. "Let him sit in it. A pause can strike harder than a speech if you believe what follows." Keanu practiced until the pauses became as natural as breath. When he stopped mid-sentence, the air itself seemed to lean forward, waiting. By the end of the third week, Arthur finally allowed himself a rare smile. "You're not reciting anymore. You're not acting. You're believing." That's the only thing that can pierce Cole's armor. He's heard every clever trick, every polished line, but he hasn't heard truth in decades. That's what you'll bring. Keanu felt it too. The laughter from the courtroom still echoed in his mind, but it no longer cut like a wound. Now, it burned like fuel. He wasn't walking into Cole's court to perform. He was walking in to remind the judge, the jury, and the world that the law had a heart, and he intended to make them hear it beat. Arthur closed the final casebook and pushed it aside. "Rest tonight. Tomorrow, we begin crafting the real thing." The closing argument. Your voice. Your story. The one that will decide everything. For the first time, Keanu didn't feel fear at those words. He felt ready. Rachel couldn't let go of the thread. She dove deeper into the archives, her eyes stinging from hours of scrolling through brittle scans and long-forgotten news clippings. The story took shape slowly, like a puzzle revealing its image piece by piece. Arthur Bellamy had been a rising star in the legal world. His cases were cited in law schools, his arguments praised in journals. But it was his philosophy that drew attention. He insisted that the law had to serve the people first, that rules without conscience were empty. Judges respected him, but many mocked him as an idealist, too sentimental for the cold machinery of the courts. And then there was Harrison Cole. He had started his career under Bellamy, and the early articles described him as brilliant, disciplined, and relentless. Cole admired Bellamy's fire, but didn't share his faith in principle. To him, the law wasn't about lofty ideals. It was a game of strategy, a battlefield where only victory mattered. Rachel found reports of a landmark case. The two men had fought together a corporate espionage trial that had drawn national attention. Bellamy wanted to argue for fairness, to challenge the system's abuse. Cole wanted to exploit a technical flaw in the prosecution's filing. Their disagreement became legendary in legal circles. In the end, Cole won the case on a technicality. Bellamy called it a hollow victory. Cole called it justice by the book. It was the breaking point. Bellamy walked away, leaving behind his career and reputation. Cole climbed the ladder, his cold precision earning him judgeships until he eventually reached the federal bench. Rachel sat back, her mind racing. This wasn't just a philosophical difference. It was a war of ideas that had shattered a mentorship, turned teacher and student into enemies. And now, decades later, fate had pulled them back into conflict, with Keanu Reeves standing at the center. The journalist's instincts screamed at her. This was no longer about Keanu's so-called arrogance. This was about history repeating itself, about an unfinished battle that stretched across 30 years. A mentor who had disappeared into obscurity, a protege who had become a symbol of ambition without heart, and a Hollywood actor who, knowingly or not, had stepped into the ring carrying Bellamy's old torch. Rachel typed furiously, capturing her findings in notes. She wrote down the parallels: the inventor crushed by corporations in Bellamy's cases, the artists Keanu fought to protect. The technical victories Cole had stacked up, contrasted with the moral ones Bellamy sought. Every detail deepened the story. And then she noticed something that made her pause. Every time Cole issued a ruling in the past decade, whenever a lawyer dared to invoke the spirit of the law rather than its letter, his responses were unusually sharp. He dismissed those arguments with almost personal venom, as if he were still fighting a ghost. Rachel closed her laptop, her pulse quickening. She knew what she had now wasn't just an article. It was an exposé. This trial wasn't about one foundation, one lawsuit, or one actor daring to play lawyer.
It was about a buried conflict between two men whose choices had shaped the system itself.
And if she could prove Bellamy was involved again, if she could find him, she would have the story of her career. She glanced at the photo pinned above her desk, a black and white image of Arthur Bellamy from decades ago. His eyes burned with conviction, even in stillness. "Where are you now?" she whispered into the quiet. Rachel Kim knew exactly how to press a subject until they cracked. She'd interviewed senators who thought they were untouchable, CEOs who believed charm could hide fraud, and celebrities who tried to laugh their way past scandal. Every one of them had folded eventually under her steady gaze and relentless questions. She expected Judge Harrison Cole to be no different. The interview began in his chambers, a room lined with shelves of pristine law books and framed commendations. Cole greeted her with the cool professionalism of a man who believed in his own authority. He answered her questions about procedure, about the upcoming trial, about his commitment to the letter of the law, with the same mechanical polish he used in court. He was careful, measured, almost rehearsed. Rachel let him talk, scribbling notes but hardly listening. She was waiting for her moment. And when he finished another long-winded answer about the importance of maintaining respect for judicial institutions, she slipped the name into the air as casually as if it were an afterthought. "What do you make of Arthur Bellamy's philosophy of justice?" For a split second, the mask cracked. Cole's jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed, then darted to the recorder on the table, as if it had betrayed him. The silence stretched, and Rachel knew she had struck the vein. Cole cleared his throat. "Arthur Bellamy hasn't been relevant in decades. His sentimentality about the law was a weakness, not a strength." His voice was harsher now, brittle around the edges. He shifted in his chair, the calm rhythm of the interview suddenly gone. "I don't see how a failed lawyer from 30 years ago has any bearing on this case." Rachel didn't move. "But isn't it true you once worked under him? That he was your mentor?" The color drained slightly from Cole's face. He stood abruptly, towering over the desk. "This interview is over." His words were clipped, final. He didn't even look at her as he walked to the door and held it open. Rachel gathered her notes, her pulse racing. She had seen this before, the way people reacted when a wound was touched, when ghosts they thought buried clawed their way to the surface. Harrison Cole had just confirmed everything she needed to know. That night, as she sat in her apartment typing up her notes, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She considered ignoring it until the text appeared. "If you want the truth, come to this address at midnight. Come alone." She stared at the message, the address unfamiliar. It could have been a trap, a prank, or a desperate leak. But her instincts told her otherwise. The timing was too precise, too connected to the raw nerve she had just exposed. Near midnight, Rachel found herself outside a decaying warehouse on the edge of the city. The air was cold, the streets empty. She hesitated before stepping through the rusted door, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous dark. Inside, she stopped dead. Keanu Reeves stood in the center of the room, his voice ringing with conviction as he delivered what sounded like a closing argument. His hands moved naturally, his tone steady, every word sharp with purpose. Across from him sat Arthur Bellamy, older and frail but with eyes blazing, critiquing every pause and gesture. Rachel realized she had stumbled not into rumor, but into the heart of the story. Rachel froze at the sight, her instincts telling her to retreat before anyone noticed, but it was too late. Arthur's eyes flicked to her in the shadows, sharp and unyielding despite his frail frame. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority that once commanded courtrooms. Keanu turned, startled, sweat still glistening on his brow from the intensity of practice. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The warehouse seemed to hold its breath. Rachel raised her hand slightly, showing she meant no harm. I was sent here. I got a message. I didn't mean to intrude." Arthur's expression hardened. "Who sent you?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted, forcing steadiness into her voice. "It was anonymous, just an address. But now I understand why." She gestured at the scene. "You're training him." Keanu exchanged a glance with Arthur, then stepped closer, his tone wary but calm. Why are you here? Reporters don't show up at abandoned warehouses by accident, Rachel swallowed. Because this isn't just about a lawsuit anymore. It's about you, Judge Cole, and Arthur Bellamy. I've seen the connection. I know this case is reopening something that's been buried for 30 years. Arthur's jaw tightened, his voice cut like a blade. You know nothing. Rachel met his glare without flinching. I know enough. Cole still reacts like a wounded man whenever your name comes up. I know you walked away because of principle, and he rose because of ambition. And now, he's the one mocking Keanu in court, just as he once mocked you. Silence followed, broken only by the hum of the overhead bulb. Finally, Arthur sighed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. You're sharp. Too sharp for your own good. Keanu studied her, thoughtful. She could write the truth, he said slowly. People need to know what this trial is really about. Arthur snapped his gaze to him. No, not yet. The moment she publishes anything, Cole will bury us in retaliation. The story must wait until the verdict is in. Until then, silence is your only weapon. Rachel bristled. So you want me to sit on the biggest revelation of my career? Just watch? Arthur's eyes burned into hers. Yes. If you truly want to understand justice, you'll know it's not always about being first. Sometimes it's about timing. You'll have your story, but until the trial is over, you stay quiet. You witness, nothing more. Rachel opened her mouth to argue, but Keanu spoke first. His voice was steady, almost pleading. Stay. Watch. If you see what we're fighting for, maybe you'll understand why it matters. This isn't about headlines. It's about truth. Rachel looked at him, then at Arthur. The defiance in her softened, replaced with reluctant curiosity. Slowly, she nodded. Fine, I'll stay. But know this, I'll be watching everything. And when the time comes, the world will hear the story. Arthur gave a faint nod, his eyes still wary. Then witness you shall. But remember, until the gavel falls, this room is a tomb. What's said here stays here. The warehouse had fallen quiet after Rachel's reluctant agreement to stay. The air was thick with the weight of unspoken truths, and Keanu felt that Arthur had been holding something back. For days, the training had been relentless, shaping arguments, refining tone, sharpening conviction. But there was a look in Arthur's eyes that suggested the real weapon hadn't yet been placed on the table. That night, after Rachel had settled into a corner with her notepad, Arthur rose slowly from his chair. His steps were unsteady, but his hand was firm as he reached for a battered briefcase tucked beneath a stack of old law books. The leather was cracked, the brass clasps tarnished, as if it had been untouched for decades. He set it on the table with a deliberate heaviness. This, Arthur said, his voice quieter than usual, is something I swore I'd never use. But perhaps it was kept for this very moment. Keanu and Rachel leaned forward as Arthur unclasped the case. Inside was a thin folder, its edges yellowed with age, its label faded but still legible. Cole. Draft speech, 1993. Arthur's eyes softened with memory as he slid the pages out. Long before the robe, long before ambition poisoned him, Harrison Cole wrote this. He was a young lawyer then, brilliant, idealistic. He believed the law was more than rules, it was a promise. He drafted a defense for a case that could have changed everything. He never delivered it. Instead, he abandoned these words, choosing the shortcut of technicalities over principle. I kept the draft because I thought, one day, he might remember who he was. He handed the papers to Keanu. The actor's fingers trembled as he unfolded them. The words leapt off the page, not in cold legal language, but in fire. Cole's younger voice was there in every line, speaking of justice as a living force, of courts as sanctuaries for the vulnerable, of the law as a shield for humanity rather than a cage. Keanu read aloud softly. If the law forgets compassion, it forgets its purpose. The law must not only be obeyed, it must be believed in. He stopped, his throat tightening. He wrote this? Arthur nodded. Every word. Rachel leaned in, eyes wide. This is gold. If you expose this, the world will see Cole for the hypocrite he's become. Arthur's gaze cut sharply toward her. No, this is not for headlines. This is for the courtroom. Keanu will not just defend himself, he will hold up a mirror. He will force Harrison Cole to confront the man he used to be. The strategy settled like thunder in the room. Keanu felt the weight of the paper in his hands, heavier than any script he had ever held. This wasn't just about winning a trial anymore. It was about awakening a truth buried under decades of ambition. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes burning with conviction. When you stand in that courtroom, you will use his own words. You will remind him that once, even he believed in justice. And in that moment, it will not be Cole judging you. It will be Cole judging himself. Keanu closed the folder gently, his resolve hardening. For the first time, he saw the path clearly. He wasn't just fighting for his foundation, for his reputation, or even for the people depending on him. He was fighting to bring a forgotten soul back into the light. Arthur watched Keanu close the folder with reverence, but his voice carried a warning. Understand something. This is no simple weapon. If you use it, you won't just be arguing your case. You'll be striking at Cole's identity. A man like him doesn't forgive wounds to his pride. He'll come at you with everything. Rachel frowned. Then why risk it? If this blows up, Cole could retaliate in ways you can't predict. He has the robe, the gavel, and the system at his back. Arthur turned his gaze on her, steady and unflinching. Because sometimes, the only way to shatter armor is to remind a man of the heart he buried to wear it. Cole has forgotten who he was. If Keanu holds up this mirror, even for a moment, the cracks will show. The jury will see it. The press will see it. And deep down, Cole himself will see it. Keanu placed the folder back on the table, his voice steady but resolved. If this is what it takes, I'll do it. I don't care if he hates me for it. This trial isn't about making friends, it's about truth. If Cole has spent 30 years running from his own words, maybe it's time someone forced him to face them. Arthur's lips pressed into a thin line, a mixture of pride and worry. You sound ready. But remember, belief is not enough. You must weave his words into your own, so the court doesn't see you exposing him, they see you awakening him. That's the difference between humiliation and revelation. Rachel studied Keanu with a journalist's eye. Do you realize what you're taking on? You're not just defending yourself anymore. You're staging a trial within the trial. You're putting the judge himself on the stand without him even knowing it. Keanu met her gaze, calm and unwavering. Then let him stand there. Let him hear himself. If I fall, I'll fall holding up the truth. That's more than most ever get. Arthur reached across the table and tapped the folder. We'll build around this. Every argument, every pause, every word will point back. Here, his words will become the cornerstone of your case, but you must never flinch when you speak them. The moment you show doubt, Cole will know, and he'll crush you. Keanu nodded slowly, the weight of the task settling into him like armor. He wasn't just preparing to face a judge anymore. He was preparing to face a ghost, the ghost of the man Harrison Cole once was. Rachel exhaled, shaking her head. I came here expecting to write about arrogance. Instead, I'm watching a man prepare to turn the courtroom into a reckoning. Arthur's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something fierce breaking through his fatigue. Then write it when the time comes. For now, we fight. The weeks in the warehouse blurred together until time itself seemed to dissolve. Keanu's body bore the marks of the struggle-hollowed cheeks from skipped meals, dark circles etched under his eyes from nights without rest. His hands trembled when he wasn't speaking, but when he stood to deliver an argument, a different energy took hold. The fatigue seemed to fall away, replaced by a focus so sharp it cut through the silence like a blade. Every day, Arthur drove him harder. Practice speeches lasted for hours, punctuated only by sharp critiques and long silences that forced Keanu to hear the echo of his own words. At first, he stumbled, repeating phrases or slipping into performance. But slowly, something shifted. His lines no longer sounded rehearsed. They carried weight, shaped by intellect and conviction. Rachel sat quietly in the corner, watching night after night as Keanu grew leaner, fiercer, more precise. She had covered hundreds of trials in her career, seen seasoned attorneys at their best. But what unfolded in that warehouse didn't resemble training. It felt like transformation. One night, Arthur pushed him harder than ever. Again, he barked. After Keanu finished a stirring argument about the role of justice in protecting the powerless, Keanu's voice cracked. "Arthur, I've been at this for 6 hours. My voice is gone." Arthur leaned forward, eyes burning. "And what happens when your voice is gone in court? Do you think Cole will stop? Do you think he'll give you mercy? No. You must learn to speak even when the air cuts your throat. Truth doesn't wait for comfort." Keanu straightened, chest heaving, and began again. His words came slower now, but each syllable seemed carved from stone. He spoke not to impress Arthur, not to prove anything, but because he believed every word. His exhaustion gave his tone a rawness that could not be faked. Arthur didn't interrupt this time. He sat back, listening. When Keanu finished, the warehouse went silent. Rachel held her breath, waiting for another criticism. Instead, Arthur whispered something she hadn't expected. "You remind me of him." Keanu looked up, confused. "Of who?" Arthur's gaze drifted to the shadows as if he saw a younger man standing there. "Of Cole. Not the judge you know now, the student I once taught. He was brilliant, full of fire, convinced that justice mattered. Watching you, it's like seeing the ghost of the man he used to be." For the first time, Arthur's voice carried no bitterness, only sorrow and a fragile thread of hope. "Maybe that's why you're the one who can reach him. You carry the sincerity he abandoned. You might force him to remember." Keanu swallowed hard, the words striking deeper than any critique. He wasn't just preparing for a trial anymore. He was carrying the weight of redemption, his own, his foundations, and perhaps even Cole's. Arthur leaned back, his voice softer now. "You're not rehearsing anymore. You're ready." The warehouse became a world unto itself, sealed off from everything beyond its brick walls. Days bled into nights, and nights into dawns. Keanu lived on black coffee and scraps of takeout. Rachel occasionally brought, but even she noticed that food seemed to matter less than fire. His frame grew thinner, his shoulders drawn, yet his eyes carried a light that only sharpened as the trial loomed closer. Arthur watched him like a craftsman, testing the steel of a blade. Every session was designed to break him down, to strip away any trace of performance. "You're not here to entertain," Arthur reminded him again and again. "You're here to reveal." And Keanu began to do exactly that. His actor's instinct, the timing, the ability to hold silence, the resonance of voice blended with a deeper clarity Arthur had drilled into him. When Keanu spoke now, it was not as a man trying to be a lawyer, nor as an actor reciting lines. It was as someone who had lived both pain and hope, who believed that truth deserved a voice even if the world tried to laugh it down. Rachel noticed the change, most of all. She scribbled notes furiously. Not for publication, Arthur's rules still bound her, but for herself. She wanted to capture what it looked like when a man transformed under pressure, when discipline and conviction fused into something greater than either alone. One evening she muttered under her breath, "This isn't a man preparing for court. This is a man preparing for war." Keanu caught it and smiled faintly, sweat running down his face. "Maybe that's what it is." Arthur stood then, steadying himself on the table as he rose. His voice, though gravelly, carried pride he had long buried. "You've taken everything I've thrown at you and turned it into something more. When I look at you, I see both the man I once hoped Cole would become and the man Cole fears most, a believer who won't break." Keanu bowed his head slightly, humbled. "You gave me the tools. You showed me how to see the law not as lines on paper, but as lives. Whatever happens in that courtroom, it's because of you." For a moment, Arthur said nothing. His throat worked as if words were too heavy to release. Finally, he whispered, "Then maybe I haven't wasted my life after all." Rachel looked up, startled by the raw honesty in his voice. Arthur had carried decades of bitterness, like armor, yet watching Keanu rise had cracked something open in him. For the first time, she saw not just a mentor, but a man reclaiming a sliver of faith. The training didn't grow easier, but it grew different. The critiques became less about flaws and more about refinement. Arthur's eyes lit up during certain passages, his voice steadier when he said, "That hold on to that moment." Even Rachel, hardened by years of skepticism, felt her chest tighten when Keanu's words cut through the still air like arrows. By the time the session ended that night, Keanu could barely stand. His body trembled from exhaustion, but his voice remained strong. And when he caught Arthur watching him with that rare, quiet pride, he knew the transformation was complete. He was no longer rehearsing. He was ready. The warehouse was quieter than usual that night. No books slammed onto tables, no sharp critiques echoed off the walls. For the first time in weeks, Arthur ended practice early. The strain of training and years of bitterness seemed to rest on his shoulders as he motioned for Keanu to sit with him at the battered table in the center of the room. From beneath the same briefcase that had held Cole's forgotten draft, Arthur pulled out a bottle of whiskey, its label faded and edges curled with time. He set down 2 small glasses, the kind a man keeps for rituals rather than company. He poured slowly, the liquid amber under the dim light. Keanu raised an eyebrow. "I didn't think tonight was about celebration." Arthur handed him a glass, his own hand steady, despite the wear of age. "It isn't celebration, it's remembrance. I bought this bottle 30 years ago, after my first major victory in court. I told myself I'd only open it again when I saw justice mean something real." Keanu studied the man across from him, the one who had driven him past exhaustion, who had carved away every pretense until only conviction remained. "And you're opening it now?" Arthur gave a small, weary smile. "I am, because tomorrow, win or lose, you will remind the court and Cole what justice was supposed to be. That's enough for me." They drank quietly. The whiskey burned Keanu's throat, but it carried a warmth that lingered, like fire slowly spreading through tired bones. For a moment, the warehouse didn't feel like a battlefield, but like sacred ground, where 2 men prepared not for glory, but for truth. Arthur set his glass down and leaned back. "Tomorrow, you'll be tempted to fight Cole with reason, with logic, with the sharp edges he's honed his whole life. Don't. That's his terrain, not yours. Don't try to defeat his mind. Speak to his memory. Remind him of the man he used to be." Keanu nodded, the words sinking deep. "And if he refuses to remember?" Arthur's eyes glistened faintly in the low light. "Then, at least you tried. But if even a flicker of that young man still exists in him, your words may bring it out. And that, Keanu, could matter more than any verdict." Silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of tomorrow. Later, when Arthur retired to the cot in the corner, Keanu remained. He walked slowly through the warehouse, his fingers brushing across old case files piled high on the shelves. Each file was a story, a battle fought, some won, some lost. He picked one up at random and read the faded name of a worker who had once placed his faith in the law. He imagined the man's hope, the fear, the need for someone to stand beside him. Keanu set the file back down, his chest heavy. This wasn't about one foundation or one trial. It was about whether justice still had a soul. Tomorrow wasn't about winning in the narrow sense. It was about redeeming the very spirit of justice itself. The warehouse was nearly silent, save for the faint creak of wood and the whisper of wind through broken panes. Arthur's breathing had already slowed in the corner where he slept, but Keanu remained awake. He walked the long length of the floor, each step echoing, his thoughts circling like restless birds. He stopped at the table piled with casebooks. His hand lingered over the cracked spines, the ink-stained pages filled with the lives of people who had fought for more than themselves. Farmers, workers, inventors, families, ordinary men and women who had risked everything for justice. Their voices felt present in the dust, as though the walls themselves carried their echoes. Keanu whispered to the silence, as though speaking to them. "Tomorrow, I'll carry you with me." He moved toward the far wall, where Arthur had pinned notes and outlines, each scrawled in a hand that grew shakier with time. He studied the words, some crossed out in anger, others circled with conviction. They weren't just arguments, They were fragments of Arthur's soul, a lifetime of belief poured onto paper. Keanu realized that in walking into court, he wasn't carrying only his foundation or his own dignity. He was carrying the unfinished fight of a man who had once refused to compromise and had paid with obscurity. The thought was both terrifying and clarifying. He sank onto one of the folding chairs, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. Exhaustion pressed on him, but his mind burned awake. Images of the trial filled his head, the jury's eyes, the crowd of reporters, Cole's stare heavy with disdain. But instead of fear, he felt a strange calm forming. His body trembled, yes, but inside, something solid had finally taken root. He thought of Arthur's words, "Don't try to defeat his mind, speak to his memory." That was the heart of it. This wasn't about outmaneuvering Cole. It was about piercing through 30 years of ambition to reach the young man who had once written words that glowed with belief. If he could make Cole hear those words again, not as accusations but as reminders, perhaps the courtroom would see not just a trial, but a redemption. Keanu stood, walking back to the center of the warehouse. He closed his eyes and spoke softly, rehearsing not with polish, but with sincerity. If the law forgets compassion, it forgets its purpose. Cole's own words, written long ago, filled the space. The sound seemed to rise and wrap around him like armor. He let the silence linger after, breathing in the weight of it. Tomorrow, those words would no longer belong to a forgotten draft. They would belong to the courtroom, to the people, to history. At last, Keanu returned to the cot. Opposite Arthur's, he lay down, staring at the rafters overhead. Sleep did not come easily, but he didn't fear the morning anymore. The battle would come, and he would be ready. For the first time since the laughter in the courtroom, he closed his eyes with peace. The courthouse looked less like a hall of justice and more like the epicenter of a storm. Reporters crowded the marble steps, microphones extended like weapons, cameras flashing in the gray morning light. News vans lined the street, and the air buzzed with speculation. Headlines had already been written before a word was spoken. Actor out of his depth, closing argument, disaster in the making. Inside, the tension was thicker still. Every seat in the gallery was filled journalists, law students, curious onlookers, even a handful of celebrities drawn by spectacle. The opposing counsel, a man named Victor Harlan, stood tall at his table, papers stacked neatly in front of him, his navy suit immaculate. He carried the confidence of a man certain of victory. When his turn came, Harlan's voice cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. He moved through his closing argument with surgical precision, dismantling each of Keanu's claims, weaving statutes and precedent into a web so tight it seemed unbreakable. His tone was calm, persuasive, airtight. The jury listened intently, nodding at points, pens, scratching notes. When he finished, he adjusted his cufflinks with a satisfied air, certain that the trial was his. The atmosphere seemed to confirm it. Whispers rippled through the gallery. "That's it, it's over." Even reporters in the back typed fast, already shaping narratives of Keanu's inevitable humiliation. At the defense table, Keanu sat with only a thin stack of notes, worn at the edges from his restless hands. He didn't look at them. He kept his gaze forward, calm but taut, like a man walking a wire stretched over a canyon. Judge Harrison Cole leaned back in his chair, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. The moment had arrived, the one he had been anticipating, with thinly veiled disdain. He rapped his gavel lightly, then looked down over his glasses. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his tone dry, almost mocking. "Try to be brief." The words hung in, the air like a dare. Some in the gallery chuckled under their breath. Others leaned forward, hungry for the spectacle of a Hollywood star stepping into a ring he had no business entering. Keanu rose slowly, his movements deliberate, steady. He held no heavy binders, no thick case files. Just a few worn sheets of paper, folded and refolded until they looked like they might fall apart in his hands. He didn't even glance at them as he walked to the podium. When he looked up, the room fell silent. His eyes scanned the faces before him, the jury, the press, the curious strangers who came for entertainment. And then he looked to Cole. who watched with the cool satisfaction of a man certain of his opponent's failure. Keanu drew a breath. His voice was steady, clear, carrying not the cadence of legal jargon, but the rhythm of something older, something human. "I could begin with law," he said softly, "with codes and citations, with rules twisted into knots. But law, stripped of people, is nothing more than ink on paper. And this case is not about paper, it's about lives. So I will begin with a story." The room shifted. The jury leaned forward. The reporters' fingers paused above their keyboards. Even Cole's smirk faltered, just slightly, as Keanu's words began to fill the chamber. The story Keanu chose was not about himself, nor about Hollywood, nor even about the foundation at the center of the case. It was about a boy from Detroit, one he had met through his foundation. A boy who had never touched a camera until the day a scholarship placed one in his hands. He told his story through film, Keanu said, his voice low but firm. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was about his family, about the nights he went to bed hungry, about the laughter he clung to anyway. That story changed him. It gave him a voice. And that voice mattered. He let the silence hold for a beat, then continued. Now imagine if that voice was taken away not because it lacked truth, but because someone with more power claimed it wasn't his to tell. That is what this case is about. Not contracts, not loopholes. It's about whether stories belong to the people who live them, or whether they can be stolen by those who see profit in silence. The jurors shifted in their seats, eyes narrowing with thought. Some nodded almost imperceptibly. Even a few members of the press leaned in, their skepticism slipping as they scribbled furiously. Keanu walked slowly away from the podium, closer to the jury box, his hands steady at his sides. You've heard the statutes, you've heard the rules, but rules without compassion become cages. And justice, if it forgets compassion, forgets its purpose. The last line struck like a spark. It wasn't just powerful, it was familiar. Arthur Bellamy's eyes flicked toward Cole, watching closely. The judge's face tightened, the faint smirk gone. Keanu pressed forward. Years ago, someone wrote those words. If the law forgets compassion, it forgets its purpose. Not me, not my attorney. Those words came from a young lawyer who once believed in justice more than ambition. A man who thought the law could be a shield for the powerless. I believe those words still matter. A ripple went through the gallery. Cole's hands clenched on the bench, his eyes flashing with a recognition he could not mask. Rachel, sitting near the back, saw it. Saw the way Cole stiffened, as if struck. She knew then that Keanu had placed the forgotten file into the courtroom without ever showing the paper. Keanu returned to the podium, his voice steady. I'm not asking you to see me as an actor or as a name in the news. I'm asking you to see the people this decision will affect. The artists who will either have the chance to speak or will be silenced forever. The law should not silence them. It should protect them. That's why we are here. The room was hushed. Even those who had come expecting spectacle now felt something heavier, pressing in the weight of truth, delivered not as performance, but as belief. Keanu lifted his notes, folded them, and set them aside. He didn't need them anymore. The air inside the courtroom was electric, heavy with anticipation. Every eye fixed on Keanu as he stood with nothing more than a single folder in his hand. The opposing counsel's airtight case still lingered like a polished weapon in the minds of the jury, yet somehow, Keanu's presence now felt stronger than any statute that had been cited. He began softly, almost conversationally. For weeks, you've heard numbers. You've heard legal jargon. You've heard how contracts were drafted and who filed what on which day. And I respect all of that, it matters. But beneath it, something larger is at stake. He paused, scanning the faces in the jury box, letting them feel the weight of his words. This case is not about who has the bigger firm or the louder voice. It's about whether invention belongs to the ones who dare to dream it, or whether it can be buried under paperwork by those who see it only as profit. It's about whether creativity is a gift for humanity or a commodity for the highest bidder. The jurors leaned forward, drawn in. Keanu's voice grew firmer, carrying not the cadence of an actor reciting lines, but of a man speaking truth from his bones. Progress isn't measured in dollars. Progress is measured in the stories that are told, the ideas that breathe life into our world. Every artist, every inventor, every child who sketches something on a scrap of paper, they are the ones carrying us forward. If the law forgets them, it forgets its purpose. He stepped closer to the jury. You are not just jurors today. You are human beings. And before you weigh statutes, before you measure procedure, I ask you to weigh something else: fairness, compassion. The sense we all carry when we see someone stronger take advantage of someone weaker, and we know instinctively it isn't right. The room was silent, the kind of silence that trembles because it is so full. Cameras clicked quietly in the background, but even the press seemed hesitant to break the moment. Then Keanu reached into the folder. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out the old draft Arthur had given him, the forgotten words of Judge Harrison Cole, written decades earlier, when he was still young, still unshaped by ambition's cold grip. This, Keanu said, holding up the fragile, yellowed pages, is a document written long before any of us stood in this courtroom. A draft from a brilliant young lawyer who once believed that the law was more than a machine of rules. He believed it had a heart. He looked directly at Judge Cole. The judge's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the bench. Keanu's voice lowered, almost reverent. In his own words, he wrote, "If the law forgets compassion, it forgets its purpose. If the law loses sight of humanity, it ceases to be justice and becomes tyranny." The words rang out across the wood-paneled chamber. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Jurors stared wide-eyed. And Judge Cole, for the first time, looked shaken, confronted not by Keanu Reeves, but by the ghost of his own younger self. The echo of those words seemed to hang in the rafters. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the court stenographer's hands had slowed, as though afraid to disturb the silence. Keanu held the page steady, letting the jury see the faded typewritten lines, the handwritten notes in the margin, evidence that this was no invention, but the forgotten truth of a man who once dreamed differently. He spoke again, quieter now, his tone almost tender. These words were not written by me. They were written by a man who understood that laws are only as strong as the humanity behind them. A man who believed that compassion must guide judgment, or else judgment becomes cruelty dressed in robes. His eyes locked with Judge Cole's. "That man was you." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The jurors turned toward the bench, their faces registering disbelief, curiosity, even sympathy. Cameras clicked furiously as the reporters scrambled to capture every flicker of Cole's expression. For a split second, the judge's mask slipped. His jaw clenched, his eyes flared with something recognition, perhaps even shame, before he drew back into rigid silence. But the damage was done. Everyone had seen it. Keanu pressed on. "You once stood where I stand now, facing a system that wanted to bury the truth under technicalities, and you fought to remind the law of its purpose. You wrote words that lit a path for justice, words that mattered then, and they matter now. I ask this court not to silence them, but to honor them." He turned back to the jury, holding the page as if it were sacred. "You've been told this case is about contracts and property, but really, it's about whether the law belongs to those who twist it for power, or to those who trust it to protect fairness. You, the jury, are the guardians of that trust." His hand trembled slightly, but not from fear, from conviction. "I'm not here to out-argue lawyers who know every statute. I'm here to ask you to remember why the law exists in the first place, to shield the vulnerable, to preserve the voices of those who might otherwise be silenced. That is what justice means. That is what fairness demands." A hush fell again, deeper this time, as though the entire courtroom breathed in unison. Even the opposing counsel, so smug only moments ago, now stared with unease. His carefully built case of rules and citations suddenly looked small beside the fire of forgotten truth. Keanu set the old draft down gently on the podium, almost like returning a relic to its altar. His voice softened, breaking through the stillness. The law is not just a book, it is a promise, and sometimes it only takes one voice to remind us to keep it. He stepped back, leaving the words and the silence that followed to do their work. The courtroom seemed frozen in the stillness of Keanu's last words. The jury sat motionless, some with hands clasped tightly, others staring at the fragile draft on the podium as though it carried a weight greater than law books stacked by the ton. Judge Cole cleared his throat, his voice rougher than before. "The jury will retire for deliberation," he said, though his eyes didn't meet Keanu's. He banged the gavel, and the jurors filed out, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. Reporters scrambled for the door, eager to be the first to broadcast the explosive twist. Lawyers whispered frantically on both sides. Spectators leaned toward one another in shock. Yet, through the chaos, Keanu remained calm, standing quietly at the podium. He had nothing more to give. His truth had already been spoken. Arthur, seated at the back with Rachel Kim, gave a small nod. For a man who had seen courts twist and break men for decades, there was finally something that resembled pride softening his face. Rachel scribbled notes, but even she couldn't disguise the awe flickering across her eyes. This wasn't the arrogant celebrity she had set out to expose. This was something else. The waiting stretched into hours, though in truth, the jury was gone for less than 60 minutes. When the bailiff finally announced their return, the courtroom snapped back to order. Everyone leaned forward. Cameras clicked again, buzzing like insects in the tense silence. The foreman stood, a tall woman in her 50s with silver streaks in her hair. Her voice was steady. "On the matter before us, we, the jury, find in favor of the defendant unanimously." Gasps filled the room. Keanu closed his eyes for a brief moment, not in triumph, but in quiet relief. His foundation, his reputation, and the principle he had fought for had been vindicated. But more than that, justice, true justice, had spoken. Judge Cole's face was pale. He shuffled the papers before him, but they seemed suddenly foreign in his hands. His voice, when it came, lacked its usual iron edge. "The court accepts the verdict." He looked directly at the jury, his eyes heavier than any robe could make him. "Your duty was to weigh the evidence, but you have also reminded us all of something deeper. The law must not only be fair, it must have a heart." Those words, spoken by the very man who once mocked Keanu with laughter, rippled through the courtroom like a wave. Even the stenographer paused, glancing up with wide eyes, unsure she had heard correctly. The gavel struck, and the trial was over. Keanu gathered the worn draft and held it close. As the crowd erupted into applause, cheers spilling from the gallery, he moved quietly toward the defense table. His lawyers, stunned into silence, looked at him as though they had never seen him before. And then came the applause outside. The moment he stepped onto the courthouse steps, the roar was deafening. Supporters, journalists, and strangers alike clapped and shouted his name. Not for a movie premiere, not for a red carpet, for standing in a courtroom and speaking truth. The celebration outside thundered on, but within the courthouse walls, another message was delivered. A bailiff approached Keanu quietly, leaning in so the cameras couldn't hear. "Mr. Reeves, Judge Cole would like to see you in chambers." He had expected the trial to end here, with the verdict. Yet he followed the bailiff through narrow corridors until he reached a heavy oak door. The guard opened it, and Keanu stepped into the private world of the man who had once laughed him down. The chambers were quiet, lined with shelves of leather-bound volumes and portraits of long-dead jurists staring solemnly from the walls. Behind a broad desk, Judge Cole stood by the window, his back turned, the light cutting his profile into shadow. For the first time all trial, he looked less like a figure of authority and more like a man carrying a weight. "You played a dangerous hand today," Cole said, his voice low and measured, quoting words I buried long ago. Keanu didn't answer. He simply waited, calm. allowing the silence to settle between them. Cole finally turned, his eyes not the steely gray they had been in court, but softened, conflicted. "I wrote those words when I believed in something greater than winning. Arthur and I, we dreamed the law could be a vessel of justice, not just rules. But dreams don't last long in this world. Ambition swallowed me, and I let it." He moved toward his desk, his hands trembling slightly as he rested them on the wood. "Arthur never forgave me. I never forgave myself. I laughed at you because I saw what I used to be, and I hated it." His voice cracked. "You reminded me of the man I once betrayed." Keanu nodded quietly. "Arthur never stopped believing," he said gently. "And today, you proved a part of you hasn't either." For a long time, the judge said nothing. Then he exhaled, a sound heavy with years of regret. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Not for winning, but for forcing me to look at the truth I buried." The two men stood there in silence. An unspoken truce formed between them. Not friends, not allies, but bound by the echo of a teacher they had both carried in different ways. When Keanu finally left the chambers, the applause outside was still roaring, reporters shouting his name, supporters reaching out. But his expression was calm, almost serene. He raised the fragile draft in his hand for the cameras to see, not as a trophy, but as proof that words, once believed, could outlast ambition, mockery, even time itself. The man who had been laughed at now walked into the sunlight, greeted not as an actor or even as a defendant, but as a reminder that truth spoken with conviction could shake the foundations of power. The jury disappeared into the deliberation room, leaving behind a courtroom thick with unease. Spectators whispered, reporters shuffled notes, and opposing counsel exchanged tight, confident smiles. Yet those who had watched closely knew something had shifted. Keanu's words had pierced through legal armor and struck somewhere deeper. He sat calmly at the defense table, his hands folded loosely, the worn draft still resting beside him. His lawyers, stunned into silence, could not read his face. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't fear. It was a quiet steadiness, the composure of a man who had spoken all he could speak. Minutes ticked by, then half an hour. The air seemed to hum with tension. Rachel Kim, scribbling furiously in her notebook, kept glancing toward the jury door. Arthur Bellamy, sitting farther back, leaned heavily on his cane, his eyes fixed on the front, as if willing the past to bend toward justice at last. Finally, the bailiff's voice broke the silence. "All rise." The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces grave, unreadable. Every step they took echoed like a drumbeat. The forewoman, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a steady gaze, held the slip of paper that would decide everything. The judge nodded. "Have you reached a verdict?" She spoke clearly, her voice carrying across the chamber. "We have, Your Honor. On all counts, we find in favor of the defendant. Unanimously." A collective gasp filled the room. Reporters nearly leapt from their seats, pens racing across paper. Opposing counsel slumped, their flawless strategy shattered in a single sentence. Keanu closed his eyes, drawing in a slow breath. Relief washed over him, not for reputation or image, but because the truth had not been buried. He opened his eyes and glanced toward Arthur, who gave him the smallest nod, pride shining through years of cynicism. Judge Cole shuffled the papers on his bench, his movements stiff. The courtroom waited for his words. The man who had mocked and belittled, now forced to acknowledge the outcome. When he spoke, his tone carried none of its usual steel. "The jury has spoken. This court accepts the verdict. Justice is served." His eyes lifted, meeting the jury with a gaze heavy with reflection. "You were asked to weigh evidence, but you did more. You reminded us all that the law cannot be only precise, it must be just. The law must have a heart." A ripple of astonishment swept through the room. Those words, coming from the same judge who had laughed weeks before, struck harder than the verdict itself. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards, capturing every syllable. Rachel's pen stilled as she looked up, realizing she was witnessing not only a victory, but a transformation. The gavel struck once more, and the trial was over. Keanu remained standing for a moment longer, then reached for the fragile draft. He held it gently, not as a weapon anymore, but as a reminder. As the gallery erupted into cheers and applause, he walked slowly toward the exit, the sunlight spilling through the courthouse windows like a benediction waiting outside. The applause still echoed in the halls when a bailiff approached Keanu quietly. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his tone respectful. "Judge Cole requests a word with you in chambers." Keanu hesitated, then nodded. He followed the man down a narrow corridor, away from the chaos of cameras and shouts, until he stood before a heavy oak door. The bailiff opened it, and Keanu stepped inside. The room was dim, lined with shelves of books that smelled of dust and age. Judge Cole stood by the tall window, his black robes no longer a shield, but a burden that weighed on his shoulders. For a long time, he didn't turn. His voice, when it came, was quieter than anything heard in court. "You reminded me today of someone I tried to forget." Keanu waited, letting the silence carry the weight of the confession. Finally, the judge turned, his face older, stripped of arrogance. "Arthur Bellamy was my head mentor once. He taught me everything that mattered about the law, and then I betrayed him. I chose ambition over principle, winning over truth. When I laughed at you in that courtroom, it wasn't just to belittle you. It was to silence the voice inside me that still remembered his lessons." His eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "You forced me to face the words I wrote when I still believed. Words I buried because they reminded me of what I had lost. I hated you for bringing them back, but I thank you now. Because today, you reminded me of the man I used to be." Keanu stepped closer, his expression steady, compassionate. "Arthur never stopped believing, Judge." Even when he walked away from the system, he carried the spirit of justice with him. He still does. "Maybe this verdict isn't just mine, it's his too." Cole nodded slowly, his lips pressed into a tight line. Tell him I remember. Tell him I'm sorry, though I doubt it will matter." "It will," Keanu said softly. "More than you know." For a moment, the two men stood in quiet recognition, not allies, not friends, but bound by the ghost of a teacher who had shaped them both. Then Cole straightened, his voice returning to formality. "Go on. They're waiting for you outside." Keanu inclined his head, turned, and walked out. The heavy door closed behind him with a finality that felt almost like absolution. When he emerged back into the daylight, the roar of the crowd hit him like a wave. Reporters thrust microphones forward, supporters cheered, and strangers clapped as though greeting a hero. Keanu lifted the fragile draft in his hand, holding it not as a trophy, but as proof that words once true could never die. The courthouse steps trembled under the weight of applause. For the first time in weeks, Keanu smiled. It wasn't a smile of victory, but of peace. Justice, in its truest sense, had spoken.